On a January evening in 1936, Eleanor Medill Patterson sat at the head of a table set for 40 in her DuPont Circle mansion. The china was Sèvres. The silver had belonged to someone's grandmother in Newport. Senators ate squab beside their wives, who wore pearls that caught the candlelight, and made polite sounds about the roses, imported, unseasonable, already wilting in the overheated room. Cissy, as she insisted everyone call her, held court with the practiced ease of a woman who had been performing this role since before most of her guests were born. She was 54. She owned the Washington Herald. She could destroy a political career before breakfast, or elevate a nobody with a single editorial. But as the dinner progressed, something became visible in the way she watched her guests, not with satisfaction, but with the focused attention of someone checking whether the mechanism still worked. Her daughter Felicia had declined the invitation. She was in New York. She was always in New York. The laughter around the table was real enough, but it moved past Cissy rather than toward her. Toward the end of the meal, a young congressman's wife leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something that made them both smile. Cissy saw it. She always saw it. The evening continued. The guests left at the appropriate hour, thanking her with the fluency of people who had been thanking powerful hosts their entire lives. By midnight, the house was empty, except for the staff clearing crystal in the next room. This was the machinery of Cissy Patterson's life, elaborate, expensive, and failing to produce what it had been designed for. What follows is how she built it and what it cost her to keep it running. Eleanor Medill Patterson entered the world on November 7th, 1881 in Chicago, into a family that had already decided what she was worth. Her grandfather, Joseph Medill, owned the Chicago Tribune. He had helped make Lincoln president. He counted power the way other men counted money, and he had taught his children to do the same. When Cissy was born, the third child and second daughter of Robert and Eleanor Patterson, the household did not celebrate. There was already a daughter. What the family needed was another son. Her father ran the Tribune under Joseph Medill's supervision, which meant he ran nothing. Robert Patterson was capable but soft, the kind of man who could execute someone else's vision but never articulate his own. He loved his daughters in the distracted way of men whose affection takes second place to their obligations. Cissy learned early that his attention was a limited resource, rationed according to need, and she was not the neediest child. Her older sister Josephine was delicate, prone to headaches and fainting spells that brought doctors to the house and her father to her bedside. Her younger brother, Joseph Medill Patterson, arrived in 1879, before Cissy, and corrected the family's trajectory. He was the heir. Everything else in the household oriented itself around that fact. The Patterson mansion on the north side was large enough that Cissy could go hours without seeing her mother. Eleanor Patterson, called Nellie by everyone who mattered, was a Medill by birth, which meant she carried the family's talent for ambition and its impatience with weakness. She had married her cousin Robert in a union that kept the newspaper in the bloodline, a detail Cissy would not understand as strategic until much later. Nellie ran the household with the efficiency of a general managing occupied territory. Servants appeared and disappeared according to invisible schedules. Meals were served at exact times. The children were expected to be clean, punctual, and capable of sitting through adult dinners without fidgeting. Cissy fidgeted anyway. She was a beautiful child, which people mentioned frequently, as though beauty were a compensatory prize for being the wrong gender. By the time she was 7, she understood that her face was an asset. Her family monitored the way they monitored the circulation numbers of the Tribune. Her mother inspected her before guests arrived, adjusting a ribbon or tucking a curl behind her ear with the focused attention of someone arranging flowers. "Stand up straight," Nellie would say. "You're slouching again." Cissy would straighten. The guests would arrive. Someone's hand would tilt her chin upward, and a voice would declare her exquisite or a little heartbreaker, and she would smile on cue. Her grandfather, Joseph Medill, died in 1899 when Cissy was 17. She had feared him her entire life without quite understanding why. He was not cruel. He simply saw people as instruments, and he had no patience for instruments that could not perform their function. In his presence, Cissy felt herself reduced to a list of deficiencies, too emotional, too vain, too eager for approval. He spoke to her brother Joseph about ideas, about the newspaper's future, about politics. He spoke to Cissy about posture. At his funeral, Cissy stood between her parents in a black dress that had been altered twice to fit her properly. The service was elaborate. Half of Chicago's power structure filled the pews. Men her grandfather had made senators wept with what looked like genuine grief. Her father's face was blank. Her mother's jaw was set in a way Cissy recognized as fury, though at what, she could not say. Afterward, at the house, she overheard her uncle Robert McCormick, her mother's brother, speaking to another man in the library. "The old bastard split the stock evenly between Nellie and Kate," he said, referring to Cissy's mother and aunt. "Not the sons-in-law, the daughters. He didn't trust the men to hold it." This was the inheritance, not affection, not approval, but a controlling share in a newspaper empire divided between two women who had spent their entire lives proving they were as ruthless as their father. Cissy's mother now owned half the Tribune and had no intention of remaining a silent partner. The shift in the household was immediate. Nellie attended board meetings. She vetoed editorial decisions. She fought with her sister Kate over mastheads and budgets and the direction of the paper, fights that spilled into family dinners and made the servants nervous. Cissy watched her mother become more powerful and more isolated in the same motion. Nellie had no friends, only allies and rivals. She spoke to her daughters about marriage the way she spoke about investments, something to be researched, timed, and executed with precision. "Beauty fades," she told Cissy on more than one occasion. "You need to use it while you have it." The message was clear. Cissy's value had a limited shelf life. Her brother Joseph would inherit influence. Her sister Josephine's delicacy had made her unmarriageable, a permanent dependent who would live in her parents' house and take nervous pills prescribed by an endless rotation of doctors. Cissy's role was to marry well, not happily. No one used that word, but well. Someone with a name that would reflect favorably on the family. Someone whose social position would justify the expense of her upbringing. She understood this without resentment, at least at first. In 1901, at 19, she was one of the most beautiful young women in Chicago. Men stared at her in restaurants. Older women murmured to each other when she entered a room. Her mother hired a French maid whose sole job was to manage Cissy's wardrobe and hair. The investment was paying dividends. Invitations arrived daily. Her dance card filled before she arrived at parties. She learned to smile in a way that suggested interest without promising anything. A skill her mother had taught her with the same precision she used to teach her which fork to use for fish. But at night, alone in her bedroom in the vast North Side mansion, Cissy sometimes stood at the window and looked out at the lake. The water was black and went on forever. The city behind her was full of people who wanted something from her family: access, favors, editorial space, money. She was 19 years old. She had been taught to sit correctly, to speak French, to deflect proposals until a better one arrived. She had never been taught what to want for herself. The question had never come up. It would not occur to her to ask it for another 20 years, and by then the asking would come too late. Cissy's debut into Chicago society occurred in the winter of 1901, orchestrated by her mother with the attention to detail Nellie usually reserved for hostile acquisitions. The event itself was a dinner dance at the Patterson mansion. Notable not for its opulence, every family of their standing could afford imported orchids and a 16-piece orchestra, but for the precision with which the guest list had been assembled. Nellie invited families whose sons were heir to railroad fortunes, banking dynasties, or political legacies that stretched back to the founding. She did not invite families whose money was too new, whose scandals were too recent, or whose social ambitions exceeded their actual position. The evening was not a celebration. It was an audition. Cissy wore white as required. The dress had been made in Paris, shipped in tissue paper, and fitted 3 times by a seamstress who worked in silence while Nellie circled, pointing out flaws invisible to anyone else. The neckline was too high, then too low, then acceptable. Cissy stood still for hours during these sessions, watching herself in the mirror while her mother transformed her into something sellable. On the night of the debut, she descended the staircase at the appointed time and saw her future arranged in the foyer below. 23 young men in evening dress, their mothers clustered near the doorway, their fathers talking to her father about grain futures and municipal bonds. She danced with 11 of them, Their names blurred together. They asked polite questions about her hobbies. She had been instructed to mention piano and literature, but not horses, which made her sound too athletic. And she gave polite answers. One of them stepped on her foot. Another had visible sweat on his upper lip by the second waltz. A third, the son of a steel magnate, told her she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen, a declaration that seemed to exhaust his conversational capacity. She smiled at all of them. Her face ached by midnight. After the debut, the invitations multiplied. Newport in the summer, New York for the opera season. Private balls where the same people circulated through the same rooms, performing the same rituals. Cissy attended because her mother insisted, and because she had begun to understand that this was her job. Her brother Joseph was at Yale, being groomed for newspaper management. Her sister Josephine was upstairs under doctor's orders to avoid excitement. Cissy's task was to be seen, to be envied, and to secure a proposal that would justify the cost of her existence. The proposals came. A banker's son from Philadelphia offered marriage after a single dinner, a desperation Nellie found insulting. A congressman's nephew from Boston sent letters that began "My dearest Eleanor" and detailed his family's land holdings in Vermont, as though she were a business partner evaluating assets. Nellie dismissed him as boring. A young man named Frederick McLaughlin pursued Cissy for 6 months with the tireless energy of someone who had confused persistence with romance. He sent flowers daily. He appeared at parties he had not been invited to. He cornered her father at the Union League Club and asked for permission to court her officially. Nellie said no before Cissy had been consulted. "He's a coffee heir," she explained over breakfast, as though this settled the matter. Coffee. The way she said it made it sound like an infectious disease. Cissy, who had found McLaughlin tedious but mostly harmless, said nothing. She was beginning to realize that her preferences were irrelevant. The marriage was not for her. It was for the family's position, which needed to be maintained, and for her mother's ego, which needed to be satisfied. In the summer of 1903, Nellie took Cissy to Europe. The trip was framed as educational. The great museums, the architectural landmarks, the opportunity to improve her French. But its actual purpose became clear within the first week. They traveled with letters of introduction to aristocratic families whose titles were older than their fortunes. In London, they attended a dinner where Cissy was seated next to a viscount whose estate was mortgaged to American banks. In Paris, they visited a duchess whose husband's family name appeared in history textbooks, but whose actual income came from his wife's railroad money. In Vienna, they were introduced to a count. Count Joseph Gizicki was 41, 20 years older than Cissy. He was tall, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of posture that suggested military training or aristocratic discipline. He spoke 5 languages. He had fought in a war Cissy had never heard of. He owned an estate in Poland, a hunting lodge in the Austrian Alps, and a title that traced back to the 14th century. Nellie was interested immediately. They met at a reception at the American Embassy, where Gizicki was a regular fixture. He gravitated toward wealthy American families the way certain plants grow toward light. His technique was refined. He did not flatter, obviously, but listened with the intensity of someone who found everything you said fascinating. He asked Cissy about Chicago, about the newspaper business, about her impressions of Vienna. He did not mention his estate or his title. He did not need to. Other people mentioned it for him. By the 3rd week, he was calling at their hotel daily. He took them to the opera, a box he borrowed from a friend. He arranged a private tour of the Schönbrunn Palace, where he knew the curator. He sent Cissy a first edition of Goethe with a note in German she had to ask the concierge to translate. The note said, "For a woman who deserves poetry written in her honor, though none exists worthy of her." Nellie was delighted. Cissy was uncertain, which her mother interpreted as shyness. "He's perfect," Nellie said one evening as they dressed for dinner. "A genuine count, an estate. He's educated, he's traveled, and he's clearly taken with you." She adjusted Cissy's necklace, her fingers cold against Cissy's collarbone. "This is the kind of match I brought you here to make." Cissy looked at herself in the mirror. She was 22. She had been beautiful her entire life, and it had brought her to this. A hotel room in Vienna, her mother's hands arranging her like furniture, and a man twice her age waiting downstairs who had looked at her the way her grandfather used to look at ledgers, calculating value, assessing return. "What if I don't want to marry him?" she asked. Nellie's hand stopped moving. In the mirror, their eyes met. "Then what exactly," her mother said, "do you want?" Cissy had no answer. She had never been taught to formulate one. The courtship lasted 4 months, which by Joseph Gizicki's standards was a protracted negotiation. He had been married before. A detail that emerged casually during a carriage ride through the Prater mentioned the way one might mention having visited Italy or preferring red wine to white. His first wife had died in childbirth along with the infant. He said this without emotion, looking straight ahead at the tree-lined path, and Cissy understood she was supposed to express sympathy without asking questions. She murmured something appropriate. He changed the subject to the upcoming hunting season. Nellie made inquiries through the American embassy. The story was confirmed. Countess Gizicka, deceased 1895, no surviving children. The estate in Poland was real. 18,000 acres, a manor house, forests, villages of tenant farmers. The title was legitimate, documented back to 1340. The Count's financial situation was less clear, but Nellie was not particularly concerned about his money. She had enough. What she wanted was the title, the European sophistication, the ability to introduce her daughter as Countess Gizicka at dinner parties in Chicago. Joseph proposed in October, in the gardens at Schönbrunn. He knelt with the practiced grace of someone who had performed the gesture before and presented a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, set in gold that had tarnished slightly at the edges. Cissy accepted because her mother was watching from a bench 20 feet away, and because at 22 she had been trained to understand that refusing a count was not the action of a reasonable woman. The engagement was announced in the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. The headline in the Tribune read, "Miss Eleanor Patterson to wed Polish Count." The article listed Joseph's military service, his estates, his lineage. It did not mention that he had spent the previous 15 years circulating through European capitals and American resort towns looking for heiresses. It did not mention the incident in Monte Carlo in 1899, where he had been asked to leave a casino after a dispute over cards. It did not mention that his estate in Poland generated almost no income, and that the manor house had not been properly maintained in a decade. The wedding took place in April 1904 at the Patterson Mansion in Chicago. It was elaborate enough to demonstrate the family's wealth and tasteful enough to suggest they had not needed to try too hard. 300 guests, a dress from Worth in Paris. A reception that lasted until 2 in the morning, with champagne brought from France and an orchestra Nellie had hired away from a New York hotel for twice their usual rate. Joseph moved through the evening with the ease of someone accustomed to being celebrated, shaking hands with Chicago's industrial elite, charming Cissy's aunts, dancing with her mother in a gesture everyone agreed was gracious. Cissy watched him perform and felt the first stirrings of something she would not have called fear, not yet, but a kind of alertness, the instinct of prey that has not yet seen the predator but has sensed its presence. During the reception, she caught him watching her from across the ballroom with an expression that was not affection or desire, but assessment, as though he were taking inventory. When she met his eyes, he smiled. She smiled back. The guests applauded. They left for Europe the following week. The honeymoon was to include Paris, the Austrian Alps, and finally Poland, where Cissy would see her new home. In Paris, Joseph took her to restaurants where the waiters knew him by name and brought him wine he had not ordered. He introduced her to friends, minor nobility, displaced aristocrats, men who called him Gizzy, and spoke in rapid French that excluded her from the conversation. At night, in their hotel suite, he came to her bed with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a task. Afterward, he returned to his own room. She lay awake, listening to traffic on the boulevard below, and tried to remember what she had imagined marriage would feel like. The hunting lodge in the Alps was worse. It was isolated, 3 hours by carriage from the nearest town, surrounded by mountains that looked beautiful from a distance and oppressive up close. Joseph spent his days shooting game with a precision that seemed more like execution than sport. He brought back deer, boar, a chamois whose head he said he would mount in the Great Hall in Poland. Cissy was expected to admire the kills, to praise his marksmanship, to sit quietly in the lodge while he and his hunting companions, men who materialized from Vienna or Budapest, invited without consulting her, drank late into the night. One evening she mentioned that she might like to return to Paris or perhaps visit her family in Chicago. Joseph looked at her as though she had suggested something obscene. "You just arrived," he said. "You haven't seen the estate yet. You haven't met the tenants. You haven't—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "You're my wife now. You'll go where I decide we go." It was the first time he had spoken to her in that tone, flat, final, stripped of the charm he had used during the courtship. Cissy felt something shift in her chest, a small collapse, like a building settling on a weak foundation. She did not argue. She had been raised to understand that arguing with men achieved nothing. They arrived at the estate in Poland in late June after 2 days of travel through countryside that grew progressively poorer and more remote. The manor house appeared at the end of a tree-lined drive, large, stone, older than anything Cissy had seen in America, and in visible disrepair. Sections of the roof were missing tiles, the gardens were overgrown, the entrance hall smelled of damp and smoke and something else she could not identify. Decay, maybe, or just time. The servants were waiting in a line, 12 of them, in clothes that had been clean once. They spoke only Polish. Joseph addressed them briefly, gesturing toward Cissy. They stared at her with expressions that were not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. She was a foreigner, American, too young, brought here for reasons they probably understood better than she did. Joseph dismissed them with a wave. That night, in the bedroom that was now hers, Cissy stood at the window and looked out at the forest beyond the estate. It stretched for miles, dark and unbroken. There were no lights except the manors, no neighbors, no roads visible. She thought of her mother's house in Chicago, of her room overlooking the lake, of the city lights that had always made the darkness manageable. Here, the darkness was total, and she was alone in it. The estate was called Nowosielka, though Cissy could never pronounce it correctly, a failure Joseph mentioned often enough that she stopped trying. The manor house had 40 rooms, most of them unused. The furniture was centuries old, upholstered in fabrics that released dust when touched. Portraits of Giziki ancestors lined the walls, stern men in military uniforms, pale women in high collars, all watching with expressions of aristocratic disapproval. Cissy had her own suite, a bedroom, a sitting room, and a small study that overlooked the kitchen garden. Joseph's rooms were in another wing. He came to her 3 or 4 times a week, always at night, always without warning. The first time he hit her was in August, 6 weeks after their arrival. She had asked about returning to America for Christmas, just a visit, she said, to see her family. Joseph was reading a newspaper, Austrian, a week old by the time it reached the estate. He did not look up. "No," he said. "I haven't seen my mother since the wedding," Cissy said. "Surely—" He threw the newspaper aside and crossed the room in 3 strides. The slap caught her across the cheek with enough force to knock her against the chair. She tasted blood. Her ear rang. Joseph stood over her, breathing heavily, his face red. "You will not question my decisions," he said. "You are my wife. You live where I say you live." She pressed her hand to her face, too shocked to cry. He walked out. She heard his boots on the stairs, the front door slamming, then the sound of his horse being brought from the stable. He rode out into the forest and did not return until dark. The servants had heard. They said nothing, but their silence was a form of acknowledgement. The housekeeper, an older woman named Marta, who spoke a little German, brought Cissy ice wrapped in cloth. She did not meet Cissy's eyes. Cissy sat in her room until the swelling went down, then came to dinner as though nothing had happened. Joseph was courteous. He complimented the cook. He mentioned that he would be traveling to Vienna the following week for business. He did not apologize. Cissy understood that he never would. The isolation at Nowosielka was its own violence. The nearest town was 8 miles away, accessible only by carriage on roads that turned to mud after rain. Cissy had no friends, no visitors except Joseph's acquaintances, men who came to hunt and treated her as decorative furniture, nodding politely before returning to their conversations in Polish. She wrote letters to her mother, careful letters that described the manor's architecture and the forest's beauty. but said nothing about Joseph's temper or her own unhappiness. She knew Nellie would read discontent as failure, as proof that Cissy had not tried hard enough to make the marriage work. The replies from Chicago were infrequent and brief. Nellie wrote about newspaper circulation, about social engagements, about Josephine's health, which remained poor. She asked no questions about Cissy's life. She sent money, which Joseph intercepted and deposited in his own account. When Cissy asked for an allowance, Joseph laughed. "You're a countess," he said. "What do you need money for?" By winter, she was pregnant. The realization came with nausea that lasted weeks, followed by a doctor from the town who examined her without gentleness and congratulated Joseph in Polish. Joseph seemed pleased or at least satisfied. He stopped coming to her room. He spent more time in Vienna, leaving Cissy alone at the estate for weeks at a time. She did not mind his absence. It was the only peace she had. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick constantly. Her body swelled in ways that frightened her. The servants watched with expressions she could not read. Pity, maybe, or the grim recognition of women who had seen this before. Marta brought her tea that was supposed to help with the nausea. It did not help. Cissy spent hours in her room staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine the child as something that would improve her situation. She could not make the equation work. The baby, a daughter, was born in May 1905. The labor lasted 14 hours. The doctor was drunk when he arrived, sober by the time he left. Joseph was in Vienna. He returned 3 days later, looked at the infant briefly, and said, "You'll call her Felicia." It was his mother's name. Cissy had not been consulted. Motherhood did not improve anything. Felicia cried constantly, a thin wail that echoed through the manor. Cissy tried to nurse and could not. A wet nurse was brought from the village, a young woman who took the baby to another room and cared for her with competence that made Cissy feel obsolete. Joseph showed no interest in his daughter. He resumed coming to Cissy's room, ignoring her protests that the doctor had said to wait. "The doctor," Joseph said, "is a peasant." In the fall, Cissy's brother Joseph visited, sent by Nellie to check on her. He arrived in a car he had hired in Vienna, bringing American newspapers and a suitcase full of gifts that felt like messages from another world. A book of poetry, chocolate, a photograph of the family at their summer house in Lake Forest. Joseph was 26, confident in the way of young men who had never been denied anything. He took one look at Cissy, thinner, pale, her eyes hollow, and his expression changed. "Jesus Christ," he said. "What has he done to you?" "Nothing," Cissy said automatically. They were in the drawing room. Joseph was upstairs. The servants were out of earshot, but she had learned to assume someone was always listening. "I'm fine. It's just the climate. And the baby—" "You're not fine." Joseph kept his voice low. "Mother wants you to come home, just for a visit. Bring Felicia. Stay through Christmas." "Joseph won't allow it. He doesn't have to allow anything. You're an American citizen. He can't keep you here." But he could, and they both knew it. Cissy had no money of her own. She had a passport Joseph kept locked in his desk. She had a child who could not travel without her father's permission. She had married a man who owned her the way he owned the estate, the forests, the servants. Joseph stayed 3 days. He argued with Joseph in German, a shouting match behind closed doors that ended with Joseph ordering him to leave. Joseph left. At the door, he held Cissy's hands and said, "Write to me if you need anything, anything." She nodded. She did not write. She knew no letter would leave the estate without Joseph reading it first. Cissy left Novoselica in February 1908, 3 years after Felicia's birth. She did not call it leaving. She called it visiting her family in America, a trip Joseph had finally permitted after months of requests that had escalated into arguments, then into something worse. The night before her departure, Joseph came to her room and told her she could take Felicia for 6 months. Not longer. He would be watching. If she attempted to stay in America permanently, he would come for the child himself. She sailed from Hamburg with Felicia and a Polish nursemaid Joseph had insisted accompany them. The crossing took 9 days. Cissy spent most of it in her cabin, watching her daughter sleep and trying to calculate how much of the 6 months she could stretch before Joseph's patience expired. Felicia was nearly 3, small for her age, with dark hair and her father's serious expression. She spoke more Polish than English. She cried when the ship's engines started, a sound that would not stop until they reached open water. Chicago felt like returning from the dead. Her mother's house was warm, electric lit, filled with servants who spoke English, and did not look at her with pity. Nellie took one look at Cissy and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're staying." It was not a question. "Joseph wants us back in 6 months." "Joseph," Nellie said, "can go to hell." The legal battle began in April. Nellie hired lawyers, 3 of them, expensive, connected to judges and legislators. They filed for divorce in Chicago on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. Joseph responded by filing for custody in Austria, claiming Cissy had kidnapped his daughter. The case became international news. "Countess flees brutal nobleman," the Tribune headline read, a piece Cissy's own family had published. "American heiress in transatlantic custody war." The articles detailed Joseph's violence in language carefully calibrated to scandalize without exposing Cissy to libel suits. Some of it was true, some of it was exaggerated. All of it was humiliating. Joseph sent letters, first pleading, then threatening. He missed his daughter. He had been a good husband. Cissy was hysterical, influenced by her domineering mother, incapable of rational thought. When the letters did not work, he traveled to New York and demanded to see Felicia. Nellie's lawyers obtained an injunction. Joseph appeared at the Patterson house anyway, shouting in the street until police removed him. Cissy watched from an upstairs window, Felicia in her arms. The child asked who the angry man was. Cissy said, "No one." The divorce was granted in November 1908. Cissy was awarded full custody. Joseph was ordered to pay support he had no intention of providing. He returned to Austria and went silent for 18 months, a silence Cissy learned not to trust. In May 1910, Cissy took Felicia to Europe. It was supposed to be cultural: Paris, London, museums, and parks, the kind of trip wealthy Americans made to ensure their children grew up with sophistication. They stayed at good hotels. They hired a governess, an Englishwoman who taught Felicia French and corrected her posture. In Vienna, Cissy made the mistake of visiting friends at the embassy, people who had known her during the marriage. Joseph found out within a week. He appeared at their hotel on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men Cissy did not recognize. She was in the lobby when they arrived. Felicia was upstairs with the governess. Joseph walked past the front desk as though he owned the building, saw Cissy, and did not break stride. "Where is she?" he said. "You need to leave," Cissy said. Her voice was shaking. The desk clerk was watching. Other guests had turned to stare. "You have no right." "I have every right. She's my daughter." He started toward the stairs. Cissy moved to block him. One of the men, large, with a face that suggested he had been hired for situations exactly like this, took her arm and moved her aside with enough force that she stumbled. Joseph climbed the stairs. Cissy ran after him, shouting for the governess, for hotel security, for anyone. She reached their suite as Joseph was lifting Felicia from her bed. The child was screaming, reaching for the governess, who stood frozen in the doorway. Joseph said something to her in German. Later, Cissy would learn it was a threat about what would happen if she interfered, and carried Felicia into the hall. The 2 men blocked Cissy from following. By the time hotel staff arrived, Joseph was gone. He had a car waiting. He drove to the Austrian border and crossed before anyone could stop him. Cissy collapsed in the hotel hallway. Guests stepped around her. The governess was crying. Someone called for a doctor who arrived and gave Cissy a sedative that made the room blur, but did not make the screaming in her head stop. She spent the night composing telegrams to her mother, to the American embassy, to anyone with power or influence. The responses came slowly. The embassy was sympathetic but clear. Austrian law favored the father. Kidnapping was not kidnapping when the father was a count with connections to the imperial court. She hired lawyers in Vienna. They filed motions, submitted briefs, argued in courts where the judges addressed Joseph as Your Excellency and Cissy as Madame. The case dragged through the summer. Cissy was permitted to see Felicia twice, supervised visits in Joseph's lawyer's office where the child sat on her father's lap and would not look at her mother. The governess reported that Felicia was living at Joseph's apartment in Vienna, cared for by his sister, a woman Cissy had met once and who had made clear she considered Americans vulgar. By September, Cissy understood that Law would not return her daughter. She began making other arrangements. Through contacts at the embassy, people who owed her family favors or wanted future considerations, she found a man willing to negotiate outside legal channels. His name was never written down. The price was $30,000 paid in cash to accounts in Switzerland and Budapest. The transaction included bribes to Joseph's servants, to Austrian border officials, and to Joseph himself, though this was phrased as a settlement of financial disputes. Joseph agreed to return Felicia in exchange for money and a promise that Cissy would never bring the child to Europe again. The exchange took place in December 1910 at a hotel in Budapest. Felicia was handed over by Joseph's sister, who said nothing. The child was 5 years old. She had not seen her mother in 7 months. When Cissy reached for her, Felicia flinched. They returned to America on the first available ship. Felicia cried most of the crossing. She had nightmares. She wet the bed, something she had not done in years. Cissy held her and tried to convince her she was safe now, but the child did not believe her. Cissy could see it in her eyes. The knowledge that safety was not real, that the people who were supposed to protect you could not, that the world was a place where you could be taken without warning and given back only when someone paid enough. Felicia spoke less after they returned to Chicago. Not silence exactly, but a careful conservation of words, as though language itself had become untrustworthy. She answered questions with single syllables. She did not volunteer information. When Cissy asked what had happened in Vienna, gently, during the quiet hours before bed, Felicia turned her face to the wall and said nothing. The doctors Nellie summoned used words like traumatic episode and nervous exhaustion. They prescribed rest, routine, fresh air. One suggested boarding school in Switzerland, which Nellie considered before Cissy threatened to leave the house and never return. Another recommended keeping the child away from newspapers, as though Felicia could read the articles about her own kidnapping that still appeared sporadically when editors needed to fill space. The scandal had made her famous in the worst way. People stared at her on the street. At the park, other children's mothers pulled them away, as though custody disputes were contagious. Cissy tried to build something that resembled normalcy. She enrolled Felicia in a private school where the head mistress had been paid enough to discourage questions. She hired tutors for French and piano. She took her daughter to museums, to the zoo, to Marshall Fields, where they bought dresses Felicia did not want and wore only when forced. The child was compliant but absent, performing the motions of childhood without inhabiting them. At night, Felicia had nightmares. Cissy would wake to screaming from the next room and find her daughter sitting up in bed, eyes open but not seeing, calling for someone in Polish. The nursemaid said it was the name of Joseph's sister. Cissy would hold Felicia until the shaking stopped and the child would eventually sleep again. But the distance between them remained. Whatever had been broken in Vienna could not be repaired by proximity or money or maternal devotion applied too late. Nellie's solution was distraction. She involved Cissy in the newspaper business, a role Cissy had never asked for but accepted because the alternative was sitting alone in the house, watching her daughter retreat further into silence. The Tribune was engaged in a circulation war with Hearst's Examiner. Nellie needed someone to manage society coverage, to leverage the Patterson name for access to events that mattered. Cissy discovered she had a talent for it, not journalism exactly, but the performance of knowing things before other people knew them. She attended dinners and extracted information. She befriended wives of industrialists and politicians. She learned who was sleeping with whom, who was bankrupt, who was about to be indicted. Felicia spoke less after they returned to Chicago. Not silence exactly, but a careful conservation of words, as though language itself had become untrustworthy. She answered questions with single syllables. She did not volunteer information. When Cissy asked what had happened in Vienna, gently, during the quiet hours before bed, Felicia turned her face to the wall and said nothing. The doctors Nellie summoned used words like traumatic episode and nervous exhaustion. They prescribed rest, routine, fresh air. One suggested boarding school in Switzerland, which Nellie considered before Cissy threatened to leave the house and never return. Another recommended keeping the child away from newspapers, as though Felicia could read the articles about her own kidnapping that still appeared sporadically when editors needed to fill space. The scandal had made her famous in the worst way. People stared at her on the street. At the park, other children's mothers pulled them away, as though custody disputes were contagious. Cissy tried to build something that resembled normalcy. She enrolled Felicia in a private school where the head mistress had been paid enough to discourage questions. She hired tutors for French and piano. She took her daughter to museums, to the zoo, to Marshall Fields, where they bought dresses Felicia did not want and wore only when forced. The child was compliant but absent, performing the motions of childhood without inhabiting them. At night, Felicia had nightmares. Cissy would wake to screaming from the next room and find her daughter sitting up in bed, eyes open but not seeing, calling for someone in Polish. The nursemaid said it was the name of Joseph's sister. Cissy would hold Felicia until the shaking stopped and the child would eventually sleep again. But the distance between them remained. Whatever had been broken in Vienna could not be repaired by proximity or money or maternal devotion applied too late. Nellie's solution was distraction. She involved Cissy in the newspaper business, a role Cissy had never asked for but accepted because the alternative was sitting alone in the house, watching her daughter retreat further into silence. The Tribune was engaged in a circulation war with Hearst's Examiner. Nellie needed someone to manage society coverage, to leverage the Patterson name for access to events that mattered. Cissy discovered she had a talent for it, not journalism exactly, but the performance of knowing things before other people knew them. She attended dinners and extracted information. She befriended wives of industrialists and politicians. She learned who was sleeping with whom, who was bankrupt, who was about to be indicted. The work was absorbing enough that entire days passed without her thinking about Joseph or Vienna, or the look on Felicia's face when she had been handed back like disputed property. But at night, alone, the accounting came. She had paid $30,000 to recover her own daughter. She had been forced to negotiate with a man who had beaten her, who had taken a child across borders as leverage, who had walked away richer for his cruelty. The law had called this resolution. Cissy called it ransom. She did not see Joseph again, but his presence remained. Felicia was technically still a Gazika, a name that appeared on school records and legal documents. Cissy could not change it without reopening the divorce, which her lawyers advised against. The marriage had been dissolved in America, but not in Austria. Joseph could theoretically claim parental rights if Cissy returned to Europe. She would not return. The continent had become a threat geography, a place where her citizenship meant nothing, and her money only bought temporary safety. By 1912, Cissy had begun to understand that Felicia would never forgive her, not for the kidnapping. The child did not blame her for that, but for the marriage itself, for bringing her into the world with Joseph Gizicki as a father. It was not a conscious accusation. It lived in the way Felicia looked at her, or more precisely, the way she looked past her, as though Cissy were an unreliable narrator of her own story. That summer, Cissy met Elmer Schlesinger at a dinner party in Lake Forest. He was a lawyer, 43, respectable in the way of men who had built their reputations without scandal. He specialized in corporate law, representing railroads and meatpacking companies in disputes with unions and regulators. He was not handsome. He was not charming. He was stable, which after Joseph felt like oxygen after drowning. He courted her carefully, aware that she was damaged goods in the eyes of society. Divorced, notorious, mother to a strange and silent child. He did not seem to care. He sent flowers. He invited her to the opera. He asked permission before touching her hand. After 6 months, he proposed. The ring was a diamond, modest by Patterson standards, presented without flourish in the parlor of her mother's house. Cissy accepted before she had time to consider why. The wedding was small, a deliberate contrast to the spectacle with Joseph. Nellie approved. Schlesinger was American, Protestant, solvent, and uninterested in controlling the Tribune. Felicia, 9 years old, attended in a white dress and stood beside her mother without smiling. When the minister asked if anyone objected, there was a silence that lasted longer than it should have. The marriage was better than the first, which was not the same as good. Schlesinger was kind. He did not hit her. He did not lock doors or read her mail or threaten to take Felicia. He was boring. He came home at 6, ate dinner, read the evening paper, and went to bed by 10. His idea of conversation was summarizing cases he was working on, disputes over grain elevator leases or freight rates. Cissy listened and felt her mind wander to other rooms, other lives, other versions of herself that might have emerged if different choices had been available. He tried with Felicia, which Cissy appreciated even as she watched it fail. He asked about her schoolwork. He bought her books. He offered to teach her chess, a game she learned quickly and then refused to play again. She was polite to him, which was worse than hostility. Politeness was the courtesy you extended to strangers. After a year, Schlesinger stopped trying. He treated Felicia the way he treated Cissy's mother's furniture, something that was there, that had to be accommodated. But that was not his to change. Cissy had married him for safety, and discovered that safety was another form of suffocation. She was 31 years old. She had escaped violence and landed in tedium. Her daughter barely spoke to her. Her husband barely saw her. She had become invisible in her own life, a supporting character in a story she could not remember agreeing to. At night, she stood at the window of the house Schlesinger had bought in Washington. He had taken a position with a firm there, another decision made without consulting her, and looked out at the street. Cars passed. Lights came on in other houses. Somewhere in those houses were people living lives that felt more real than hers. She pressed her hand to the glass and felt nothing. Washington was smaller than Chicago, but denser with power, a city where proximity to government created its own weather system. Schlesinger's law practice flourished. He represented companies that needed access to congressmen, which meant dinners at houses where policy was discussed over brandy and cigars. Cissy was expected to attend, to be decorative, to remember names and avoid controversial opinions. She had performed this role before. She was good at it. She hated it. The house on DuPont Circle was Schlesinger's idea, purchased in 1915 after 2 years in a rented townhouse that Cissy had never bothered to decorate. The new house was massive, 3 stories, 20 rooms, a ballroom that could hold 100 guests. Schlesinger saw it as an investment in his career. Cissy saw it as another stage set where she would perform being someone's wife. She hired decorators who filled the rooms with furniture she did not choose and art she did not like. The house appeared in the society pages. Mrs. Elmer Schlesinger's DuPont Circle residence showcases European elegance. The article included a photograph of Cissy standing in the drawing room, smiling at the camera with an expression that could have meant anything. Felicia, 13, had refused to be photographed. She was at boarding school in Connecticut by then, a decision Cissy had initially opposed before recognizing that her daughter preferred distance. The letters from Felicia were dutiful and empty. She was doing well in her classes. She had joined the riding club. She would be home for Christmas. The letters never asked how Cissy was, never mentioned Schlesinger, never suggested she missed home. Cissy wrote back with equal formality, describing dinner parties and museum exhibitions, filling pages with information that required no emotional response. They had become correspondents, not mother and daughter. Schlesinger began staying late at the office. At first, it was cases, a railroad merger, a labor dispute that required extended negotiations. Then it was simply habit. He would arrive home after 9, eat a cold dinner the cook had saved, and retreat to his study. Cissy stopped asking about his day. He stopped asking about hers. They moved through the house on parallel tracks, occupying the same space without intersecting. In 1916, Cissy began an affair with a congressman from Ohio. His name was Nicholas Longworth, and he was married to Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice. The affair was not passionate so much as available, a mutual arrangement between 2 people who had discovered that their marriages were performances that exhausted them. They met in hotel rooms during the afternoon, between his committee meetings and her social obligations. They did not discuss their spouses. They did not pretend this was love. It was an escape that lasted 6 months before someone saw them leaving the same building at the same time, and the rumor reached Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who responded by cutting Cissy at every social event they both attended for the next 3 years. Schlesinger heard the rumor and said nothing. Cissy waited for confrontation, for anger, for something that would indicate he cared. He maintained his routine: office, dinner, study, bed. The only change was that he stopped coming to her bedroom. The marriage had become a legal arrangement they both honored without inhabiting. By 1920, Cissy was 39 and invisible. She attended dinners where men discussed the League of Nations and prohibition, while their wives compared vacation houses in Newport. She hosted parties at DuPont Circle where guests praised the food and left without remembering she had been there. She visited Felicia at school and watched her daughter perform polite conversation with the practiced detachment of someone describing weather. She returned to Washington and felt time passing without direction, each day identical to the one before. The divorce from Schlesinger happened quietly in 1925, after 13 years of marriage that had produced nothing except mutual indifference. He did not contest it. He moved to New York for a position with a larger firm. They divided assets with the efficiency of business partners dissolving a failed venture. He kept the house in Washington initially, then sold it back to Cissy 6 months later when he realized he would never return. She paid market value. It was the most honest transaction of their marriage. Felicia was 20 by then, living in New York, engaged to a man named Drew Pearson. Cissy met him twice before the wedding, a journalist, ambitious, intelligent, with the kind of focused intensity that reminded her uncomfortably of her own family. Felicia seemed happy, or at least less absent. At the wedding, Cissy watched her daughter smile at her new husband and felt the distance between them calcify into something permanent. Felicia had found someone else to trust. Cissy had lost her chance years ago in Vienna, or perhaps earlier, in the decision to marry Joseph Gizicki at all. After the wedding, Cissy returned to the DuPont Circle house alone. She was 44. She had been married twice, divorced twice. She had a daughter who tolerated her and a mother who still tried to manage her life from Chicago. She had money enough that she would never need to work and no idea what to do with the time that stretched ahead. She began sleeping late, sometimes until noon. The servants learned not to disturb her. She stopped accepting dinner invitations, then stopped opening the mail that contained them. The house, so carefully decorated, became a place she moved through without seeing. Rooms stayed dark because opening curtains required effort she could not summon. Her mother visited in December and was appalled. "You're rotting," Nellie said, standing in the drawing room, where dust had settled on surfaces the maid had given up cleaning. "You look terrible. You're wasting yourself." "I'm resting," Cissy said. "You're disappearing." Nellie walked to the window and opened the curtains, flooding the room with winter light that made everything look worse. "You need work. You need purpose. Sitting in this house feeling sorry for yourself is not a life. What would you suggest?" "The newspaper," Nellie said. "The Herald is for sale. William Randolph Hearst wants to unload it. It's losing money, but it's salvageable. I'll arrange the financing. You'll run it." Cissy looked at her mother silhouetted against the window and saw the calculation she had seen her entire life. This daughter is a problem. This is how we solve it. But beneath the resentment was something else, a flicker of interest, the first thing she had felt in months that was not numbness. "I don't know anything about running a newspaper," Cissy said. "You'll learn," Nellie said, "or you'll fail. Either way, you'll stop dying in this house." 3 months later, Cissy Patterson became editor and publisher of the Washington Herald. She was 45 years old. She had no experience. She had nothing left to lose. The Washington Herald offices were on 13th Street, a 5-story building that smelled of ink and cigarette smoke, and the particular staleness of a failing enterprise. Cissy arrived on her first day in March 1930 wearing a fur coat that cost more than most of the staff earned in a year. The city editor, a man named Frank Waldrop, watched her walk through the newsroom and later told colleagues he had assumed she would last 2 weeks. The paper was bleeding money, circulation under 60,000 in a city where the Post had twice that. The staff was demoralized. The equipment was outdated. Previous editors had tried to compete by imitating the Post's seriousness, which had succeeded only in making the Herald boring as well as irrelevant. Cissy looked at the numbers, read 2 weeks of back issues, and understood that respectability was not an option available to her. She would have to do something else. She started with the society pages, which she rewrote herself. Not the usual announcements of who attended which embassy dinner, but gossip, who drank too much, who left with someone else's husband, which senator's wife was seen arguing in public at the Mayflower Hotel. She named names. The first issue under her direction generated 6 threats of lawsuits and a subscription surge of 3,000 readers. Waldrop came to her office and told her she could not print that kind of material. She asked if he wanted to keep his job. He did not bring it up again. Within 6 months, circulation was up to 75,000. Cissy had discovered that Washington's powerful families, so careful about their public images, were fascinating when described accurately. She assigned reporters to follow senators to speakeasies during Prohibition, to track which congressmen kept apartments for women who were not their wives, to document the private lives that everyone knew about but no one printed. The other papers called it yellow journalism. Their readers called the Herald to subscribe. But the gossip was not the point, or not the only point. Cissy was learning that a newspaper could be a weapon, and she had targets. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who had cut her for years after the Longworth affair, appeared in the Herald with unflattering frequency. Small items about her parties, her clothes, her aging appearance, each one carefully worded to avoid libel while conveying contempt. Alice responded by banning Herald reporters from her events. Cissy responded by having them attend anyway and write more detailed accounts based on servants' gossip. In 1931, Cissy went after Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady had made comments about newspaper sensationalism during a press conference. Cissy took it personally. She ran a series of editorials questioning Eleanor's competence, her appearance, her right to political opinions. Mrs. Roosevelt would do well to remember, one editorial concluded, that being married to the president does not make one qualified to govern. The attacks continued for months. Eleanor stopped mentioning the Herald by name, which Cissy interpreted as victory. The staff learned to fear her. She fired editors without warning, sometimes for articles she had approved the day before. She changed front-page layouts at the last minute, forcing pressmen to work through the night. She decided which stories mattered based on personal grudges rather than news value. A senator who had been rude to her at a dinner party found his corruption investigation on page 1. A businessman who had sent flowers after her mother's death got favorable coverage of his failing bank. Waldrop stayed because he was practical and the paper was finally making money. Other editors left and were replaced with people willing to tolerate Cissy's management style, which was erratic and absolute. And she would vanish for days, then appear at midnight demanding rewrites. She would kill stories that had taken weeks to investigate because she had changed her mind about the subject. She would promote reporters she liked and destroy careers of those she did not, often for reasons that had nothing to do with their work. By 1933, the Herald had the highest circulation of any Washington paper. Cissy had transformed it from irrelevant to essential, and not through superior journalism, but through a willingness to print what others would not. People read it the way they watched car accidents, horrified but unable to look away. Advertisers bought space because readers bought papers. Cissy's mother, visiting from Chicago, told her she had finally done something worthwhile. Cissy smiled and said nothing. She knew what she had actually done. She had found a way to hurt people legally. The power was intoxicating. A mention in her paper could ruin a reputation or launch a career. Politicians returned her calls immediately. Embassy parties that had once excluded her now arrived in engraved invitations she mostly ignored. She discovered that being feared was more satisfying than being liked and easier to maintain. But the operation was personal in ways that made the staff uncomfortable. Cissy used the paper to attack Felicia's ex-husband, Drew Pearson, after the marriage ended badly in 1936. Pearson had become a syndicated columnist, and Cissy ran articles questioning his ethics, his reporting, his character. She assigned reporters to investigate his finances and his personal life. When Felicia asked her to stop, Cissy refused. "He hurt you," she said. "I'm defending you." "You're embarrassing me," Felicia said. "You're making it worse." Cissy ran another attack piece the following week. The relationship with Felicia, already damaged, deteriorated further. Her daughter visited less frequently. Phone calls became shorter. By 1937, Felicia had moved to New York permanently, seeing her mother only on holidays, and then only when unavoidable. Cissy told herself it was Felicia's problem, that her daughter had always been ungrateful, had never understood what Cissy had sacrificed for her. At night, alone in the DuPont Circle house, Cissy edited copy and drank scotch and felt the power of the paper beneath her hands. She could pick up the phone and ruin someone's career. She could write an editorial and change policy. She could make people afraid. It was the first time in her life she had controlled anything, and the fact that the control was destructive did not diminish its appeal. She had spent decades being acted upon, by her mother, by Joseph, by Schlesinger, by a world that treated women as decorative objects. Now she acted. The fact that her actions caused pain was almost incidental. Pain was proof of impact, and impact was proof she existed. Felicia married again in 1939, her second attempt at a marriage that might work. The groom was a writer named Tom White, younger than her first husband, less ambitious, less likely to build a career that would threaten Cissy's need for control. The wedding was small, held at a friend's apartment in Manhattan. Cissy was not invited to help plan it. She received the announcement 3 weeks before the event, a card with neat handwriting that conveyed the essential information and nothing else. She attended wearing black, which Felicia later told friends was typical, her mother's ability to make even a wedding feel like a funeral. Cissy brought a gift, an antique silver tea service that had belonged to her grandmother, expensive and completely wrong for a couple living in a 2-bedroom apartment who rarely entertained. Felicia thanked her with the polite distance of someone acknowledging a stranger's courtesy. The reception lasted 2 hours. Cissy left after 40 minutes, citing a headache. The truth was simpler. She could not bear to watch her daughter be happy in a life that did not include her. Felicia had built something separate. Friends who did not know about Vienna or Joseph or the custody battle. A husband who saw her as a person, rather than as Cissy Patterson's damaged daughter. At the reception, Cissy had watched Felicia laugh at something Tom said. A genuine laugh, unguarded, and had felt something collapse in her chest. Her daughter had learned to be happy. She had simply learned it with other people. Cissy returned to Washington and threw herself into the paper with renewed intensity. The Herald was thriving. Circulation near 100,000, profitable for the first time in a decade. She had merged it with Hearst's Times to create the Times-Herald, a move that had required negotiations she had handled herself, proving to the men in the room that she understood balance sheets and leverage. The merged paper dominated Washington journalism. Politicians feared it. Advertisers needed it. Cissy's power was real and measurable. She used that power against her son-in-law. Not immediately. She waited 6 months until the marriage appeared stable, but then began running items about Tom White's writing, always framed as literary criticism but laced with personal contempt. A review of his novel called it derivative and self-important, the work of a man who mistakes verbosity for depth. Another piece questioned whether his latest magazine article plagiarized an essay published years earlier in an obscure journal. The accusations were baseless. Cissy did not care. Felicia called from New York, her voice tight with anger. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" Cissy was at her desk at the paper, editing copy while she talked. It was past midnight. The newsroom beyond her office was mostly empty. "You know what? The review, the plagiarism piece, you're attacking Tom. I'm running honest criticism. If he can't handle scrutiny, perhaps he should reconsider his career. He's my husband, which is precisely why I'm ensuring the paper maintains objectivity." Cissy marked a correction on the page in front of her, then continued. "If we gave him favorable treatment simply because he married you, that would be nepotism." The silence on the line lasted long enough that Cissy thought Felicia had hung up. Then, "You can't stand it, can you? That I found someone, that I'm happy." "Don't be dramatic. You've spent your entire life destroying everything you touch, your marriages, your friendships. Now you're trying to destroy mine." "I gave you everything," Cissy said. Her hand had stopped moving on the page. "I fought for you. I paid to get you back from your father. I've supported you. You bought me back like I was furniture. Then you spent the rest of my childhood reminding me what you paid. Every argument, every time I disappointed you, you'd bring up Vienna, how much it cost, how grateful I should be. You have no idea what I sacrificed. I know exactly what you sacrificed. Nothing. You sacrificed nothing. You made choices that benefited you, and then presented them as gifts to me." Felicia's voice had gone cold, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this speech in her head many times. "You married a man who beat you because you wanted a title. You had a child because that's what was expected. You fought for custody because losing would have embarrassed you. Everything you've ever done has been about your ego. I was just collateral damage." Cissy felt something sharp behind her ribs, a pain that was not quite physical. "That's not true. Leave Tom alone. Leave my marriage alone. If you can't be happy for me, at least have the decency to stay out of my life." The line went dead. Cissy sat holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone, then slowly replaced it. The copy in front of her had become unreadable. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and tried to remember when Felicia had become someone she did not recognize, before realizing the question was backwards. Felicia had not changed. Cissy had simply never learned to see her as anything other than evidence of her own failure. She ran one more piece about Tom White, a sidebar in the book section questioning his sales figures, and then stopped. Not because of Felicia's call, she told herself, but because the story had exhausted its interest. The staff knew better. They had watched Cissy weaponize the paper against personal enemies before. The sudden silence on Tom White could only mean one thing. Cissy had lost something she cared about more than revenge. Felicia did not call again. Christmas came and went without an invitation to New York. Cissy's birthday in November passed without acknowledgement. In March 1940, she learned through a society column, not her own paper, which would have been humiliating, but the New York Times, that Felicia was pregnant. The news arrived in print before it arrived by phone. Cissy read the announcement twice, then folded the paper and left it on her desk for the cleaning staff to discard. The baby, a girl, was born in August. Cissy sent a gift, a silver rattle, expensive and impersonal. Felicia sent a thank you note, 3 sentences, typed. No photos, no invitation to visit, no suggestion that Cissy would be part of her granddaughter's life in any meaningful way. Cissy told herself it did not matter. She had the paper. She had power. She had a house full of beautiful things and a staff that executed her orders and a social position that made other people nervous. She had built a life that functioned without depending on anyone's affection. The fact that it felt empty was irrelevant. Emptiness was manageable. It was need that destroyed you. She returned to work and fired an editor who had missed a typo. She rewrote the front page to emphasize a story that would embarrass a senator who had voted against her interests. She stayed at the office until 3 in the morning, went home to DuPont Circle, slept 4 hours, and returned before dawn. The machinery was still running. That had to be enough. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Cissy Patterson wrote an editorial titled "Not Our War." It appeared on the front page of the Times-Herald, positioned where most papers were running maps of the German advance. The piece argued that Europe's conflicts were Europe's problem, that American boys had died in the last war for nothing, that Roosevelt's obvious sympathy for Britain was dragging the country toward another disaster. The editorial was clear, forceful, and wrong in ways that would become obvious later, but were popular enough at the time. Isolationism had momentum in 1939. Charles Lindbergh was drawing crowds with speeches about America first. Midwestern senators were blocking aid to Britain. Cissy's editorial struck a chord with readers who remembered the previous war's casualties and saw no reason to repeat them. Circulation jumped. Letters to the editor ran 10-1 in favor. Cissy wrote another editorial, then another. By December, the Times-Herald had become Washington's most prominent isolationist voice, which meant Cissy had positioned herself against Roosevelt, against Churchill, and against the direction history was already moving. Roosevelt mentioned the Times-Herald by name during a press conference in January 1940, calling it an example of journalism that serves special interests rather than national interest. He did not name Cissy directly, but everyone understood who he meant. She responded with an editorial questioning his competence, his unprecedented third term, his wife's meddling in policy. The White House stopped returning her calls. Cissy told her editors this was proof she was hitting targets that mattered. The attacks intensified through 1940 and into 1941. Cissy ran front-page editorials opposing Lend-Lease, opposing the draft extension, opposing anything that moved America closer to war. She published letters from mothers who did not want their sons sent overseas. She gave space to speakers from the America First Committee. She printed Charles Lindbergh's speeches in full. Her editorial page became a gathering place for isolationist sentiment that was part genuine conviction, part opportunism, and part personal vendetta against a president who had dismissed her. Her staff was uncomfortable. Frank Waldrop, the city editor who had survived her purges, told her privately that she was on the wrong side. "This war is coming whether we want it or not," he said. "Hitler isn't going to stop. We can't sit this out." We don't have to choose sides in a European conflict, Cissy said. That's Roosevelt's vanity talking. He wants to play Churchill's savior. He's trying to stop fascism. He's trying to build his legacy. She lit a cigarette, her fourth of the meeting. The British Empire is collapsing, and Roosevelt wants to prop it up with American lives. I'm not going to help him. Waldrop left the meeting and told colleagues that Cissy was making decisions based on spite rather than judgment, that she had confused editorial independence with personal grudge-holding. He was right, but the paper was hers, and the editorials kept coming. Pearl Harbor arrived on December 7, 1941, and should have ended the debate. It did not. Cissy ran a front-page editorial the next day supporting the declaration of war against Japan. Impossible not to, but continued questioning involvement in Europe. Even after Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later, she published pieces arguing that Roosevelt had provoked the attack, that his policies had made war inevitable, that American boys were dying for British imperialism. The editorials were not technically treasonous, but they were close enough that the FBI opened a file. Agents interviewed her staff, asking about her sources, her contacts, whether she had connections to German sympathizers. They found nothing actionable. Cissy was not a Nazi, just spectacularly wrong, but the investigation became public knowledge. Other papers reported it. Cissy's enemies in Washington, which by now included most of the administration, used it to marginalize her. Her isolation grew. Invitations to White House events stopped arriving. Embassy dinners no longer included her name. Society hostesses who had courted her for years began crossing her off guest lists. Cissy told herself it was political persecution, that Roosevelt was punishing her for opposition, that this proved she was dangerous to power. But the truth was simpler. She had chosen the losing side for personal reasons, and Washington was a city that did not forgive that kind of mistake. The worst part was that her position was not even consistent. She supported the war against Japan. They had attacked America, after all, but opposed it in Europe, where the threat was clearer and more existential. She praised American troops while questioning the cause they fought for. She ran stories about war bond drives while editorializing against the taxes that funded them. The incoherence was visible to anyone paying attention. Cissy had built her position from anger at Roosevelt, not from principle, and it showed. By 1943, the war's direction was clear. The Allies were winning, slowly but inevitably. Cissy's editorials became more defensive, more focused on criticizing Roosevelt's domestic policies than the war itself. She attacked his handling of rationing, his expansion of executive power, his plans for post-war Europe. Some of this was legitimate criticism. Most of it was noise, the sound of someone who had been wrong about the defining event of the era and was trying to distract from that fact. Her daughter Felicia, whose husband was overseas with the army, stopped speaking to her entirely. The previous distance had been about personal grievances. This was about Cissy's public position on a war where people Felicia loved were risking their lives. Cissy wrote letters trying to explain her editorial stance, letters that came back unopened. She called and reached Tom White's mother, who said Felicia did not want to talk to her. Cissy accused her of turning Felicia against her. The call ended with both women shouting. The Times-Herald's circulation, which had peaked in 1941, began to decline. Advertisers quietly reduced their buys. Readers canceled subscriptions. The paper was still profitable, still powerful, but the trajectory had shifted. Cissy had built her influence on being willing to say what others would not. She had not considered what would happen when what she said turned out to be indefensible. At night, alone in the DuPont Circle House, she listened to radio reports from Europe. Cities liberated, concentration camps discovered, the scale of Nazi atrocities becoming undeniable. She did not change her editorial position. She did not apologize. She told herself that opposing the war did not mean supporting Hitler, that her isolationism had been about American interests, that history would vindicate her. History would not vindicate her. But by the time that became clear, she had stopped caring what history thought. The DuPont Circle mansion had been designed for gatherings of 60 or 70, but by 1944, Cissy was lucky to assemble 30. The invitations went out on heavy cream paper with engraved script, sent to senators and cabinet members and embassy officials who had once competed for seats at her table. Most sent regrets. Some did not respond at all. The acceptances came from people who needed something from her newspaper, or who were too new to Washington to understand that being seen at Cissy Patterson's house was no longer an asset. She held a dinner party in March 1944, ostensibly to celebrate her 62nd birthday, though no one mentioned her age. The guests arrived in the formal wear she required, black tie, evening gowns, and moved through the rooms with the careful politeness of people fulfilling an obligation. A younger congressman from Indiana who had never met her before asked which embassy she represented. His wife shushed him. Cissy overheard and smiled as though it were a compliment. The food was elaborate: oysters, pheasant, imported cheese that had required special permits during rationing. The wine was French, from bottles her late mother had purchased before Prohibition. Nellie had died in 1939, leaving Cissy her share of the family newspaper empire and the knowledge that she had, at least once, made her mother proud. The inheritance had been substantial. The approval had come too late to mean anything. Cissy sat at the head of the table and watched her guests eat. They talked about the war, carefully avoiding the editorials she had written, the positions she still held. A State Department official described the situation in Italy. A senator's wife mentioned her son, stationed in England, preparing for something everyone knew was coming but could not name yet. Cissy asked pointed questions, trying to steer the conversation toward controversy, toward something that would make the evening memorable. Her guests deflected with practiced ease. They had learned how to dine with her: eat well, say little, leave promptly. By 10 o'clock, the dining room was empty. The guests had made their excuses: early meetings, long days, the general exhaustion of wartime Washington. Cissy stood in the foyer watching the last car pull away, then turned to find her butler clearing glasses with the efficiency of someone who had managed many disappointing evenings. "They used to stay until midnight," she said. "Yes, madam." He did not look up from his work. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where the maid had already turned down the bed and sat at her vanity. The woman in the mirror was 62, but looked older, the skin looser than it had been, the lines around her eyes deep enough to be permanent. She had been beautiful once. People had said so constantly, as though beauty were the most important thing she possessed. Perhaps it had been. Now it was gone, and she was discovering that the power she had built in its absence was not enough to fill a dinner table. The parties continued because stopping them would have been an admission of something Cissy was not ready to admit. She held a garden party in May that drew 40 guests, most of them junior staff from embassies where the senior officials had declined. She hosted a reception in July for a visiting British journalist, a man who had written critically of Churchill and whom Cissy hoped would validate her wartime editorials. He spent the evening drinking her scotch and left without mentioning the war at all. She began inviting younger people, journalists from her own paper, lawyers starting their careers, the children of people who had once been her equals. They came for access, for the chance to meet whoever else might attend, for the free alcohol and food that was still abundant at her house despite rationing. They did not come for her. Cissy understood this, but told herself it was strategic, that cultivating the next generation was wise. But late in these evenings, after most guests had left, she would corner someone, a young reporter, a congressional aide, and talk at them about her newspapers, her influence, her importance to Washington. They would nod and smile and look for an exit. She drank more, not dramatically. She was not falling down or slurring words, but steadily, starting earlier in the day, maintaining a level that softened the edges. Scotch before lunch, wine with dinner. Another scotch after, while she edited copy in her study. The staff noticed, but said nothing. It was not their place to comment, and besides, it made her less volatile. Drunk, she was maudlin rather than cruel. In October, she fired her social secretary, a woman who had worked for her for 6 years. The reason given was incompetence, but the actual trigger was that the secretary had suggested canceling a Christmas party Cissy was planning. "No one will come," the secretary had said, then immediately regretted it. Cissy told her to pack her things and be gone by the end of the day. The woman left in tears. Cissy hired a replacement who lasted 3 weeks before quitting. The Christmas party happened anyway. Cissy sent 200 invitations and received 47 acceptances, a response rate that would have humiliated her if she had allowed herself to acknowledge it. She did not. She told her staff the intimate gathering would be more pleasant than the crowded affairs of previous years. She ordered more food than could possibly be eaten. She hired musicians, a string quartet that played in the ballroom, while guests stood in small clusters, talking to each other and glancing at their watches. Felicia did not attend. She had not attended anything at the house since before the war. Cissy had sent her an invitation anyway, hope disguised as formality, and received no response. Her granddaughter was 4 years old now, a child Cissy had met once, briefly, during a trip to New York that had been tense and short. Felicia had kept the visit to an hour, tea in a hotel lobby, with the child silent and confused about who this older woman was. Cissy had brought gifts, a doll, expensive and European, that the child had held awkwardly before handing it to her mother. The party ended by 11. The staff cleaned in silence. Cissy sat in the drawing room with the last of the scotch and listened to the house settle around her. The musicians had been paid. The caterers had left. The flowers would be dead by morning. She had spent thousands of dollars to prove she could still gather people under her roof, and had succeeded only in demonstrating how few of them wanted to be there. She finished her drink and climbed the stairs to bed, where sleep came eventually, dreamless and insufficient. The first serious incident happened in January 1946, 3 months after the war ended. Cissy collapsed in her office at the Times-Herald mid-afternoon while arguing with an editor about a headline. One moment she was standing at her desk, gesturing at the page layout, insisting the font size was wrong. The next, she was on the floor, conscious but unable to stand, her left arm numb. The editor called for help. An ambulance arrived. By the time they reached the hospital, sensation had returned to her arm, but the doctor kept her overnight for observation. The diagnosis was vague: exhaustion, stress, possibly a minor stroke, though the tests were inconclusive. The doctor, younger than her son-in-law and visibly uncomfortable delivering instructions to a woman who owned a newspaper, told her to rest, to reduce her alcohol consumption, to consider stepping back from the demands of daily management. Cissy listened with the expression of someone receiving a weather report, thanked him politely, and returned to work 3 days later. She did not reduce her drinking. She reduced her sleep instead, staying at the office later, arriving earlier, as though sheer presence could compensate for whatever was failing in her body. The staff noticed she moved more slowly, that her hand shook when she held a pen, that she sometimes lost her train of thought mid-sentence and had to be reminded what she had been saying. No one mentioned it. Mentioning Cissy's vulnerabilities was a termination-level mistake. By spring, the headaches had started. Not occasional tension headaches, but daily events that made light painful and required her to retreat to her office with the curtains drawn. She took pills, aspirin at first, then stronger prescriptions she obtained from doctors who did not ask too many questions. The pills helped with the pain, but left her foggy, detached, less sharp in meetings. She compensated by becoming more aggressive, making decisions faster, firing people preemptively for mistakes they had not yet made. In June, she fell on the stairs at DuPont Circle. The butler found her at the bottom, conscious but dazed, her ankle already swelling. She claimed she had tripped, but the maid who had been upstairs said there was nothing to trip on. The carpet was intact. The lighting was fine. The doctor who examined her ankle asked if she had been dizzy before the fall. Cissy said no. The maid, standing outside the room, said nothing but exchanged a look with the butler that contained the shared knowledge of employees who see everything and report nothing. The ankle healed badly. Cissy refused physical therapy, refused to use the cane the doctor recommended, and walked with a limp she pretended not to have. Stairs became difficult. She stopped going to the second floor of the mansion unless absolutely necessary, converting a first-floor study into a bedroom. She told visitors it was more convenient. The staff understood it was because she could no longer trust her balance. Her relationship with her doctors deteriorated. She went through 3 in 1946 alone, firing each when they suggested changes she was unwilling to make. The fourth, a man willing to prescribe what she wanted without argument, became her regular physician. He gave her pills for pain, pills for sleep, pills for anxiety. She took them in combinations she decided herself, washing them down with scotch, ignoring the warnings about interactions. The pills accumulated on her bedside table, in her desk drawer, in her purse, bottles with dates months old, prescriptions she had filled and forgotten about. The paranoia started gradually, or perhaps it had always been there, and the pills simply made it visible. She became convinced the staff was stealing from her. She conducted inventories of the silver, the wine cellar, the jewelry she rarely wore. When nothing was missing, she accused them of moving things, of going through her papers, of reporting to someone, she was never clear who, about her activities. The butler, who had worked for her for 15 years, quit. The cook followed. By the end of 1946, the household staff turned over completely every few months. She revised her will constantly, a compulsion that consumed hours. Her lawyer visited monthly to document new changes. Bequests added, removed, adjusted. She left money to charities she had never supported, then crossed them out in favor of individuals she barely knew. She cut people out for imagined slights, then restored them after reconsidering. The will grew to 40 pages, then 60, a document so complex her lawyer warned it would be contested immediately after her death. Felicia was in the will, then out, then in again, with conditions. The Times-Herald would go to her daughter, but only if she moved back to Washington, or it would go to her staff, divided among editors who had tolerated her, or it would be sold, and the proceeds donated to causes Cissy listed and then revised. The lawyer took notes and said nothing about the impossibility of executing such contradictory instructions. In April 1947, Cissy had another collapse, this time at home. The new maid found her in bed, barely responsive, surrounded by empty pill bottles. The hospital kept her for a week. The doctors used words like accidental overdose and medication mismanagement, carefully avoiding the word suicide. Cissy, once she regained clarity, insisted she had simply been confused about which pills she had already taken. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps it was not. The doctors were not confident enough to argue. She returned to DuPont Circle thinner, weaker, more dependent on staff she did not trust. She stopped going to the office regularly, conducting business by phone from her bedroom, yelling at editors who could not see her face and therefore could not measure how much effort the yelling required. The paper continued functioning, but her control was slipping. Decisions she made were quietly reversed. Stories she killed were published anyway. The staff had learned to manage around her. Her 65th birthday in November 1947 passed without celebration. No party, no dinner, no guests. The staff presented her with a cake she did not eat. Felicia sent a card which arrived 3 days late and contained one sentence: "Happy birthday, Mother." Cissy put it in a drawer with other cards from previous years, all equally brief, all evidence of a relationship that existed only in its most formal rituals. She spent the evening in her bedroom, going through photographs from decades earlier. Her debut, her first wedding, Felicia as a child. The images were evidence of a life that had happened, that could not be disputed, but they felt like documentation of someone else's existence. The beautiful girl in the white dress, the young mother holding an infant, the confident woman at a podium. Cissy could not connect them to the person she had become. She closed the album and took her pills, more than prescribed, less than dangerous, enough to ensure sleep would come without dreams. July in Washington was oppressive even in wealthy neighborhoods, but Cissy kept the windows closed and the curtains drawn. The house had become a climate she controlled absolutely, dark and cool and sealed against the city beyond. She rarely left her bedroom by the summer of 1948. Meals came on trays she picked at and sent back mostly untouched. The staff entered only when summoned, delivering pills, removing dishes, adjusting pillows. They spoke in whispers even when she was awake, as though practicing for a future where silence would be permanent. She spent hours on the phone calling the Times-Herald offices to issue instructions that contradicted orders she had given the day before. The editors had developed a system: agree with everything, implement nothing, wait for her to forget. She usually did. Her short-term memory had become unreliable, erased by pills and alcohol, and the simple exhaustion of a body that was shutting down in stages. But her long-term memory remained sharp, cruelly so. She could recall every slight from 40 years ago with perfect clarity, while forgetting conversations from that morning. In early July, she summoned her lawyer to revise the will again. He arrived at DuPont Circle with his briefcase and his patience, both worn from previous visits. Cissy was in bed, propped against pillows, a glass of scotch on the nightstand, despite the hour being barely noon. She wanted to cut Felicia out entirely this time. Her daughter had not visited in over a year, had not called in months. The ingratitude was intolerable. "You've removed her before," the lawyer said carefully, "and reinstated her. This time is permanent. Mrs. Patterson, she abandoned me, just like her father, just like everyone." Cissy's hand shook as she lifted the glass. Some of the scotch spilled on the sheets. She did not notice. "Write it down. Everything goes to the staff. They're the only ones who stayed." The lawyer wrote it down, knowing he would return next month to write something different. He had 6 previous versions of her will in his office, each one contradicting the others, each one signed with the shaky signature of a woman who believed she was imposing order on chaos, but was actually creating more of it. After he left, Cissy tried to get out of bed and discovered her legs would not cooperate properly. The left one, the one she had injured in the stairway fall, had developed a persistent numbness. The right worked better, but tired easily. She made it to the bathroom, then back to bed, the trip exhausting enough that she needed an hour to recover. The maid knocked, entered, asked if she needed anything. Cissy told her to leave. The maid left, reporting to the butler that Mrs. Patterson was getting worse, that perhaps someone should call the daughter. The butler said Mrs. Patterson would fire anyone who contacted Miss Felicia without permission. On July 24th, Cissy did not call the office. This was unusual enough that Frank Waldrop, still the city editor after surviving 18 years of her management, called the house. The butler answered, said Mrs. Patterson was resting and could not be disturbed. Waldrop asked if she was all right. The butler hesitated, then said he did not know. Waldrop said to call him if anything changed. Cissy spent that day in bed, drifting in and out of sleep that was not restful. She had dreams that felt like memories. Vienna, Novoselica, Yosef's face above hers, Felicia as a child screaming in a language she did not understand. She woke in the afternoon disoriented, unsure what year it was, calling for her mother. The maid came instead. Cissy looked at her without recognition, then closed her eyes. That evening, she ate nothing from the dinner tray. She drank some water, took her pills, more than usual, the maid would later report, though she had not thought to stop her, and told the staff she wanted to be left alone. They turned off the lights and closed the door. Cissy lay in the darkness listening to the house settle. Somewhere downstairs, the staff was having dinner. She could hear the faint sound of their voices, ordinary conversation about ordinary things, a world that continued functioning, whether she was part of it or not. She thought about calling Felicia. The phone was on the nightstand, within reach. She had the number memorized. She could pick up the receiver and dial and hear her daughter's voice, if Felicia answered, if she did not hang up immediately upon recognizing who was calling. Cissy reached for the phone, then stopped. She did not know what she would say. Apology seemed insufficient. Explanation seemed impossible. The entire architecture of their relationship had been built on transactions and disappointments, and at 66, Cissy was too tired to construct something new. She took another pill instead, then another. She was no longer certain which bottles were for sleep and which were for pain, and which were for the anxiety that had become indistinguishable from her baseline state. She swallowed them with scotch and lay back against the pillows. The room was very dark. The curtains were very heavy. Nothing from outside penetrated. No streetlights, no traffic sounds. No evidence that the city beyond her walls still existed. Cissy closed her eyes and felt the pills begin their work, the slow erasure of discomfort, of thought, of the awareness that had become unbearable. The maid found her the next morning, July 25th, 1948. She had entered to open the curtains and collect the dinner tray, and discovered Mrs. Patterson still in bed in the same position as the night before, not breathing. The maid stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure of protocol, then went to find the butler. The doctor came, confirmed what was obvious, and signed a death certificate listing heart failure as the cause. This was technically accurate. Her heart had failed, though whether from natural causes or medication, or the accumulated weight of a life that had run out of reasons to continue, was a question the certificate did not address. The staff made calls. The newspaper was informed first, then the lawyer. Then, after some discussion about who should do it and what they should say, someone called Felicia in New York. A voice answered, listened, thanked them for letting her know, and asked about funeral arrangements. The voice was calm, appropriate, empty of anything that sounded like grief. Felicia arrived in Washington the following day. She came alone. Her husband stayed in New York with their daughter. She walked through the DuPont Circle mansion, looked at the bedroom where her mother had died, and asked the staff questions about the final weeks. They told her what they knew, which was not much. Mrs. Patterson had been alone. Mrs. Patterson had been in pain. Mrs. Patterson had not asked for anyone. Felicia nodded and made arrangements for the body. The funeral was scheduled quickly. Held before the Washington heat made delay intolerable. St. John's Episcopal Church, Lafayette Square, the same church where presidents attended services. Cissy had not been religious, had barely attended services in her adult life, but the church was correct for someone of her standing. The funeral director handled the details with the practiced efficiency of someone who had buried Washington's powerful before and understood that even death had protocols. The turnout was smaller than expected. A few senators sent representatives. Some newspaper editors appeared obligated by professional courtesy. Alice Roosevelt Longworth came, which surprised people who remembered the decades of mutual hostility and left immediately after the service without speaking to Felicia. The embassy crowd was mostly absent. Roosevelt's administration, which Cissy had spent years attacking, sent no one. The seats at the front, reserved for family, held only Felicia and two distant cousins who had traveled from Chicago out of duty rather than affection. The eulogy was delivered by a minister who had met Cissy twice and spoke in careful generalities about her contributions to journalism and her prominence in Washington society. He did not mention her marriages, her editorial positions during the war, or her final years of increasing isolation. He said she had been a woman of strong convictions. This was true enough that no one objected. Felicia sat through the service without crying. People noticed. They would later tell others that the daughter had seemed cold, unmoved by her mother's death, which confirmed what they had heard about the difficult relationship. But Felicia's face was not cold. It was exhausted, the expression of someone who had mourned years ago and was now simply witnessing the formality of closure. The burial was at Rock Creek Cemetery, a plot Cissy had purchased years earlier and then forgotten about, rediscovered only when her lawyer went through her papers. The gravesite was modest by Patterson standards. No elaborate monument, just a flat stone with her name and dates. Felicia stood at the edge while the coffin was lowered, holding a handful of dirt she was supposed to scatter but did not. She let it fall from her fingers and walked back to the car. The reading of the will happened 3 days later in the lawyer's office, a wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. Felicia attended, along with several Times-Herald staff members, the butler, and 2 charities Cissy had named in previous versions. The lawyer opened the most recent will, dated July 10th, 2 weeks before her death, and began reading. The document was chaos. Cissy had left the Times-Herald to 7 people simultaneously. 3 editors, 2 columnists, the business manager, and Felicia. The instruction was that they should operate it collectively in the spirit of independent journalism. There were no details about decision-making, profit distribution, or conflict resolution. The lawyer paused after reading this section, looked up at the assembled group, and saw their confusion reflected back at him. The DuPont Circle mansion was left to Felicia, if she chooses to maintain it as a residence, with the stipulation that if she declined, it would be sold, and the proceeds donated to a list of organizations Cissy had apparently copied from a directory. The American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, 3 hospitals, and, inexplicably, a Polish orphanage in Chicago that had closed in 1935. Personal items were distributed in ways that suggested Cissy had written the list while drinking. A diamond necklace went to a maid who had quit in 1945. A portrait of Joseph Medill went to an editor at the Tribune who had never met Cissy. A set of china went to Alice Roosevelt Longworth, described in the will as since she always envied it. Alice would later refuse the bequest. The butler received $50,000 and a collection of wine he was forbidden to sell. The cook who had quit in 1946 received nothing but was mentioned by name as an example of disloyalty. 3 charities received specific dollar amounts that totaled more than Cissy's liquid assets. The rest of the estate, stocks, bonds, properties, was to be distributed as the executors see fit. though she had named 4 executors with conflicting instructions about their authority. The lawyer finished reading and closed the document. "This will," he said carefully, "is going to be contested." He was correct. By the end of August, 3 separate lawsuits had been filed. The Times-Herald staff members claimed full ownership. Felicia claimed her mother had been mentally incompetent when she wrote the latest version. 2 distant relatives emerged from Chicago claiming Cissy had promised them money in conversations the lawyer could not verify. The court froze the estate pending resolution. The legal battle consumed 2 years. Lawyers deposited staff members, asking about Cissy's mental state, her drinking, her medication. They deposed doctors who had treated her, though most had incomplete records and vague memories. They examined all 6 versions of the will she had written in her final years. Looking for a pattern that would indicate her true intentions, they found only contradiction. In 1950, the court imposed a settlement. The Times-Herald was sold to Colonel Robert McCormick, Cissy's cousin, who merged it with his Washington operations before eventually shutting it down. The DuPont Circle mansion went to Felicia, who sold it within a month to a developer. The proceeds went into a trust she did not touch. The personal items were auctioned at an estate sale that drew dealers and curiosity seekers, but few genuine mourners. The mansion itself was converted into offices, then later apartments, then demolished in 1969 to make way for a modern building. No one preserved the ballroom where Cissy had held parties for Washington's elite. No historical marker indicated that Eleanor Medell Patterson had lived there. The address remained, but the structure and everything it represented was erased. The Times-Herald survived until 1954 before being absorbed by the Washington Post. Its editorial independence, which Cissy had prized above all else, disappeared into a larger operation that had no interest in continuing her legacy. The archives were scattered. Most of her editorials were not preserved. The paper she had built into a weapon, into a source of power and revenge, became a footnote in someone else's corporate history. Felicia kept almost nothing from the estate, a few photographs, her grandmother's jewelry, some letters from her childhood that Cissy had saved in a box and never mentioned. She returned to New York and did not speak publicly about her mother for the rest of her life. When asked, she would say only that it had been complicated, a word that covered everything and explained nothing. The fortune that Cissy had controlled, newspapers, properties, stocks accumulated from her mother's death and her own investments, was substantial. But the distribution was so fractured by litigation and legal fees that no single person or institution benefited significantly. The wealth that had defined 3 generations of Medills dissolved into dozens of separate trusts and accounts, administered by lawyers and banks. Funding causes Cissy had never genuinely cared about. Within 5 years of her death, Eleanor Medill Patterson had been almost completely forgotten in Washington. Her name did not appear in newspaper histories. Her house was gone. Her paper was gone. The senators and society figures who had feared her, courted her, avoided her, they moved on to new enemies and new patrons. The city rebuilt itself over the space where she had existed. The last mention of Eleanor Medill Patterson in a major newspaper appeared in 1963, 15 years after her death. It was not an obituary revival or a historical retrospective, but a single sentence in a Washington Post article about the demolition of old DuPont Circle mansions. The former Patterson residence, the article noted, once home to newspaper publisher Cissy Patterson, will be replaced by a modern apartment complex. The sentence was factual, brief, and positioned near the end of the piece, after paragraphs about architectural loss and urban development. The writer did not explain who Cissy Patterson was. Apparently, it was assumed readers would not know or care. By then, the generation that had feared her was dying or retired. The editors she had terrorized had moved to other papers or left journalism entirely. The politicians she had attacked were out of office, their careers ended by voters rather than her editorials. The society women who had competed for her approval or avoided her wrath had shifted their attention to newer hostesses with newer money. Washington's memory was short by design. Power was current or it was irrelevant. Felicia lived until 1966, dying at 50 in California from a heart attack. She had remarried after divorcing Tom White, moved west, and spent her final years painting. Landscapes mostly, sold occasionally in small galleries under a name that was not Patterson or Gazica. Her daughter, Cissy's only grandchild, inherited the trust from the estate settlement and used it to fund a career in academia. She became a professor of European history, specializing in the interwar period, and never once wrote or lectured about her grandmother. When students discovered the family connection, she would change the subject. The Times-Herald's archives were dispersed when the paper folded. Some material went to the Library of Congress, boxed and cataloged and rarely accessed. Researchers interested in Washington journalism history would occasionally pull files, looking for editorial trends or circulation data. They would find Cissy's name on mastheads and in bylines, but the actual content of her editorials, the personal vendettas disguised as journalism, the isolationist positions she had maintained past the point of defensibility, these were not considered significant enough for detailed study. Her work was mentioned in dissertations about newspaper consolidation or women in journalism, always as a secondary figure, never as the primary subject. The letters she had written throughout her life, hundreds of them, survived in various collections. Some were in university archives, donated by recipients' estates. Others remained in private hands, family papers no one had bothered to organize or destroy. A researcher in 1978 working on a book about the Medill family attempted to collect these letters to understand Cissy's perspective. He found them repetitive and self-pitying, filled with complaints about people who had wronged her, and justifications for actions she seemed to know were indefensible. The project was abandoned. The book focused on Joseph Medill and Robert McCormick instead, giving Cissy 2 paragraphs and a footnote about her controversial wartime editorials. The only photograph of her that remained in regular circulation was from 1905, taken shortly after Felicia's birth. She was 23 in the image, beautiful in a way that photographs from that era made everyone beautiful. Soft focus, careful lighting. The subject arranged to suggest grace rather than capture reality. The photograph appeared occasionally in books about Chicago history or early 20th century society, always with the same caption: Eleanor Cissy Patterson, newspaper publisher. No mention of the marriages, the custody battle, the isolation, the pills, the death alone in a dark room. In 1982, a graduate student at Georgetown attempted a biography. She spent 6 months in archives, reading through what remained of Cissy's papers, interviewing elderly journalists who had worked at the Times-Herald. The material was there, dramatic enough for narrative, documented enough for verification, but the student could not find a through line that made sense of it all. Cissy was simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, controlled and controlling, isolated by circumstance and by choice. Every interpretation the student attempted felt incomplete or dishonest. She switched dissertation topics after her advisor pointed out that a biography required sympathy for the subject, and sympathy for Cissy Patterson was difficult to sustain across 300 pages. The DuPont Circle location where her mansion had stood became, over decades, an apartment building, then offices, then condominiums. By the 2000s, the residents were young professionals who worked in consulting or government relations. People in their 20s and 30s who had never heard of Eleanor Patterson. The building had a gym in the basement and a rooftop terrace. The doorman was polite. Nothing about the structure suggested that someone powerful had once lived there, had died there, had tried to control Washington from rooms that no longer existed. The Washington Post building, which had absorbed the Times-Herald, was eventually sold and converted into a mixed-use development. The newspaper moved to a new location, then later reduced its physical footprint as print circulation declined. By 2020, most of the Post's archives were digital, accessible through databases that required keywords to navigate. Searching for Cissy Patterson returned 47 articles, most from the 1940s, most about her editorials or her feuds. The articles were available but unread, data preserved but not accessed, the digital equivalent of boxes in a basement no one visited. There was no Patterson legacy in journalism the way there was a Pulitzer legacy or a Hearst legacy. She had not invented a new form, had not uncovered a scandal that changed policy, had not mentored a generation of journalists who carried forward her approach. She had used newspapers as personal weapons, and when she died, the weapons were sold for parts. The craft she had practiced, journalism as vendetta, was not admirable enough to inspire imitators or noble enough to warrant historical reconsideration. Her great-grandchildren, if they existed, would not know her name. The family tree had branched in directions that erased her contribution to it. The money she had inherited and controlled had been distributed into trusts so fragmented that no one could trace their monthly dividend back to a woman who died in 1948. The houses were gone. The newspapers were gone. The power was gone. The beauty that had once defined her was not even a memory, just a photograph in an archive that almost no one looked at. What remained was the absence itself, the space where she had been, visible only in its outline. A gap in guest lists from the 1940s where her name should have appeared. A silence in her daughter's biography where maternal affection might have been recorded. A missing chapter in Washington's history where her influence had been real but not significant enough to preserve. She had spent her life accumulating power and using it to hurt people. She had died alone, surrounded by wealth that could not comfort her and staff who tolerated her for money. Her estate had been divided among people who did not want it. Her memory had been erased by a city that built itself over its past without looking back. In the end, she had become exactly what she feared most: forgotten, irrelevant, a name that meant nothing to anyone who mattered. In the Library of Congress, there is a box of letters Eleanor Patterson wrote between 1903 and 1947. The archival record shows it was last requested in 2003. Inside are complaints to her mother, drafts of editorials she reconsidered, a letter to Felicia from 1944 that was never sent. In it, she wrote, "I do not know how else to love people except by fighting their enemies. And when you had no enemies left, I suppose, I became one." The sentence trails off, unfinished. Her grave at Rock Creek Cemetery is flat granite, marked only with her name and dates. No mention of the newspapers or the title she once insisted people use. The plot was purchased for two. The space beside her remains empty. Moss grows in the carved letters. No flowers are ever left. The DuPont Circle mansion was demolished in 1969. The Times-Herald folded in 1954. Her editorials were not preserved. The parties, the feuds, the years she spent wielding power like a weapon, all of it dissolved faster than she could have imagined. Within a decade of her death, her name meant nothing in the city where she had been dangerous. Felicia died in 1966 and never spoke publicly about her mother. The granddaughter became a history professor and changed the subject when students asked. The wealth dispersed into trusts so fragmented, no one could trace them back to their source. The beauty that once defined her exists now only in a photograph from 1905, occasionally reproduced in books about an era most people do not remember. She had wanted to matter. She had believed that power, once seized, could fill the emptiness that marriage and motherhood had failed to fill. She had been wrong, but she had committed to the mistake completely. And there is something almost disciplined in that, the refusal to stop, even when stopping might have saved something. The question she never answered, or perhaps never allowed herself to ask, whether she recognized in those final years in the dark house with the heavy curtains that everything she had accumulated was only making the rooms feel larger and more empty. The letters sit in their box. The grave grows quieter. The addresses have been built over. And Eleanor Medill Patterson, who insisted everyone call her Cissy, remains exactly where her choices left her, erased, unremembered, and alone.